I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, we continue our investigation into the death of Kathleen Peterson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode. I'm Alice, your host, and I am joined with the wonderful co-host, Brett.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys once again.
So we're collecting ourselves right now because we just spent the last 10 minutes laughing because Brett can't pronounce his own name. And I personally think this is a ploy for him to make us all call him by his new Twitter name, which is America's Sweetheart.
You know, that was a very nice thing that somebody said. I am not forcing everyone to call me that, though I may be America's Sweetheart. I won't deny it. You know, I wouldn't want to lie.
Brett, you changed your nameplate on your desk.
You're not supposed to tell anybody that.
Well, so much for you being anonymous.
You know, we're not supposed to be as loopy and crazy today as we were on the last episode because we've actually, gotten some sleep and stuff. But I don't know what's going on.
But we really haven't. Let's
no,
be
that's
honest.
true. You never really do.
Okay, on the loopy front, let me just say something real quick. My incredibly supportive husband listens to the podcast, but today he had some constructive criticism for us. I haven't even told Brett this. He said, I get so excited to listen to your podcast. That's very sweet of him to say. But, the but. You guys sound so tired. And I was very proud of myself for not lashing out. I said, I am tired.
Yeah. I think we do a pretty good job keeping the energy up. I mean, I don't know.
Well, let's talk about today. We had, a bajillion witness interviews. I prepped an expert witness, and then I had to file an emergency motion that I wasn't expecting. And I really got kicked in my face at least 3 times by my toddler. And I think my nose is still straight, but I'm just going to bill him for my plastic surgery in a few years. So that's been my day so far. What about you, Brett?
And that's just a typical day for us.
It is a typical day. And
we're not whining or complaining or seeking your sympathy, though. If you want to sympathize with us, that'll be fun as well.
I just want you to know, if you're having a hard day and you're sitting down to listen to our podcast, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it because this is the end of our hard day, and I love doing it.
And the best part of our day.
And I hope this is chipper enough for you, husband.
Exactly. When he hears this episode, he's going to feel bad, and he should.
That is my goal. Guilt.
I thought in the episode he's talking about, we were just being thoughtful and considerate, not tired.
Or I was just sad about very horrible things happening in people's lives.
I know. Exactly. Some of this stuff is sad. It can't all be, murder and mayhem. Every now and then it's depressing. So, in any event. Well, guys, we're back for our 3rd episode on the staircase, the murder of Kathleen Peterson, and the trial of Michael Peterson. So, at this point, we've pretty much gotten you through the facts of this case and the case itself and the trial and how the trial went down and what eventually happened to Michael Peterson. But there's so much more to talk about. There's so much more that's debated about this case online. There's a lot of interesting legal questions we still haven't delved into. So we're going to do that today, and I anticipate we'll probably be doing it tomorrow as well. Strap in for 2 more episodes on the staircase, 2 more including this one. And I thought today we would start off with the timeline in this case, because even though we've gone through the murder, we never really broke it down by the minute. So you guys have an idea of just what all was going on that day in Michael Peterson's life. So we'll start with Friday, December 7th, 2001. So on that afternoon, Kathleen takes the day off from work, and the Petersons go Christmas shopping. Ordinary day, what you would expect to be happening, with only a couple weeks left before Christmas. That evening, the Petersons attended a party at the North Carolina Independent. The next day, Saturday, was December 8th, 2001. At around 3:30 p.m., and this is something that's learned after the murder, hundreds of files are deleted from Michael Peterson's PC with a disk purging program called Quick Clean. At around 4:41, Michael goes to the gym, works out for a little while, comes home, and around 6 p.m., Michael and Kathleen decide they're going to rent a movie. And the movie they rent at around 7 o'clock is called America's Sweethearts. It's my autobiography.
Don't make this about you, Brett.
At around 9:45, a young lady named Christine Tomasetti arrives. She is taking Todd Peterson to a party. And so she actually witnesses Kathleen and Michael sharing a bottle of wine. She and Todd hang out at the house for 15-20 minutes, and then they leave for this party. At around 10:40 p.m., someone with the password Atwater logs onto Michael Peterson's PC. Atwater, of course, is Kathleen's maiden name. I think it's her maiden name. I'm not sure if it's her maiden name or her married name from the last.
It was
From
her
her
previous
first
name was
husband.
Kathleen Hunt Atwater, so I think it may have been her married name from her previous marriage.
There you go. And that makes sense because Caitlin's last name is Atwater. So, in any event, certainly that's Kathleen logging in. I doubt Michael would use Atwater as his password. At 11:08 p.m., so about 30 minutes later, a coworker of Kathleen named Helen Presslinger speaks with her by phone, and at that point she says she's going to mail Kathleen a file. Kathleen has a meeting the next morning. At around midnight, 11:53 p.m., Presslinger's email arrives. It is never, or at least the email attachment is never opened. At this point, this is all based on sort of what Michael Peterson's saying, so take this with as much salt as you want to take it. Around midnight, the Petersons go down to the pool to drink and talk. Sometime between 12:30 and 2 a.m., Kathleen leaves the pool area, headed inside for bed. At some point after this, Kathleen suffers multiple deep, complex lacerations and avulsions to the scalp, multiple small abrasions and contusions on the face, early acute ischemic neuronal necrosis, and a fracture with associated hemorrhage of the thyroid cartilage in the neck. And we'll talk about all those injuries soon. At around 2:30 a.m., Peterson leaves the pool area. At 2:41 a.m., Peterson calls 911. At 2:48, so 7 minutes later, paramedics James Rose and Ron Page arrive, followed by Todd Peterson and friends. So Todd Peterson basically gets back from the party, and I believe the young lady he was with is with him and maybe one other person. At this point, obviously, Kathleen Peterson is found dead. Now, one thing to note here, it is my understanding that this is the order of arrival. So you've got these two gentlemen arriving, the paramedics, and that Todd Peterson arrived shortly thereafter. There's always been speculation that Todd or perhaps Clayton would have assisted their father in covering up the murder. I don't know about Clayton and where Clayton was at the time, but I think it's probably difficult for Todd Peterson to have done that. Around 3 a.m., police and detectives begin to arrive and to search the area. By 3:24, they are securing the scene. Now, this is a weird thing that a lot of people point to. Between 4:15 and 5 a.m., Peterson logs onto his office computer and can be heard by others mumbling to himself about email. At around 5 a.m., Peterson phones attorney Carrie Sutton, and at 5:20 a.m., Sutton arrives at Cedar Street, which is enviable for responsiveness from an attorney. I can tell you, if you call me at 5 a.m., I'm probably not going to answer, and I'm certainly not going to be at your house in 20 minutes.
I never thought about that. It is 5 a.m. she's getting the call, huh?
Yeah, I mean, she's on the ball.
Hey, if someone's paying the bill.
And, people point to this about him lawyering up as quickly as he did. His brother's an attorney. I don't have a brother, but if my brother found his wife murdered or what appeared to be murdered, or at least in a very violent scene, the first thing I would do is tell them to call a lawyer. I don't think that's ever a bad idea.
Well, and also the investigators have secured the scene. And so they're already taking steps toward treating this like a crime scene.
Right. The smart thing to do is to get a lawyer.
Yeah, don't ever talk to anyone without a lawyer if you're able to do so.
It's so funny to me. There's so many folks out there, and we love all you guys, but there's so many of y'all who really have this huge distrust of the police. And, a lot of the cases we cover, people assume the police are involved in either covering up the crime or maybe even committing the crime. And yet, when someone who's involved in one of these situations immediately reaches out to lawyers, everybody's like, oh, that's a sign he's guilty. That's not really consistent. If you think the police are liable to frame you or look at your wife at the bottom of the stairs and decide automatically without really looking into it that you are guilty of murder, the thing you should do is get a lawyer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not even because you're hiding behind anything, but there are just so many procedures and kind of gotchas that a lawyer can help you avoid.
Right. I mean, the last thing you want to happen is you become a suspect because you do something stupid. If you can imagine, and don't imagine too hard because nobody wants to think about this kind of thing, but if you can imagine the person you love the most in your life is suddenly and brutally murdered or accidentally killed, just imagine the mindset you would be in and the shock you would be in. You're not going to be acting rationally or normally. Going back to that email, some people are not the email, but Michael Peterson getting onto his computer, some people point to that as, see, no person would do that. I almost see it the other way. I think if you had murdered your wife, you wouldn't do that because you would be very conscious about appearing to be utterly distraught. You wouldn't wander off to your computer. Frankly, that seems like the kind of thing you would do when you're in shock, not when you've just murdered your wife.
Or if you're looking for your attorney's phone number.
That's also possible as well.
Yeah, I don't know, but he calls her pretty soon after.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, and the thing we want to talk about, the very first thing we played in the first episode when we talked about this was the 911 call from that night. So we're going to play that for you now, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit because this is something that people debate a lot. And I'll just say, before we even open this up, that I hate to sort of prejudge this or bias you guys, so just ignore me, but I think it is a dangerous game to try and listen to a 911 call and derive anything from it. People do it a lot. They do it in this case. The Ramsey case is another famous case where people spend a lot of time on the 911 call. But either way, where they're trying to say it shows guilt or it shows innocence, I think it's a dangerous thing. But despite it being dangerous, let's do it anyway. So here we go.
Durham 911, where's your emergency?
1810 Cedar Street, please.
What's wrong?
My wife's had an accident. She's still breathing.
What kind of accident?
She's down on the stairs. She's still breathing. Please come.
Is she conscious?
What?
Is she conscious?
No, she's not conscious.
Okay,
Please.
how many stairs did you
What?
fall down?
Huh?
How many stairs?
Stairs.
How many stairs? Calm down, sir. Calm down.
No, 15, 20, I don't know. Please, get somebody here right away, please.
Okay, somebody's dispatching the ambulance while I ask you questions.
It's off of, it's in Forest Hills, okay? Please.
So you guys just heard the 911 call, and we also played it at the beginning of the first episode. You hear Michael Peterson talking to the 911 dispatch person, and a couple of things to note. He's talking very quickly, and she's trying to ask him questions. That's what 911 dispatchers do. They try to get a sense of the information, and they have to pull it from people who are panicked. And he does sound at least panicked. He's heavy breathing, and he's saying, she's still breathing. And then one other thing to note is at the very end, I think what happens is 911 never hangs up. So the working knowledge is that the call ends because Michael Peterson ends the call. These are some aspects that people point to as being very strange. So there's a lot to cover here. Let's start first with, where do you want to start, Brett?
Well, one thing I think is interesting about this is he does exactly what you're supposed to do at the very beginning of this 911 call. He gives the address. It's the very first thing he does. There's an argument that if you were wanting to call 911 because you want to appear like you want to get help for your wife, but really in the back of your mind, you don't want help coming because as soon as the police arrive, that's when all this is going to start, that you would give some sort of rambling 911 call that wouldn't actually be helpful for the police. But it's interesting. The very first thing he says is their address, right? And so as soon as he gives that address, she's dispatching help. He doesn't know that, and he gets very frustrated with her, or he seems to get very frustrated with her because she's asking questions that he doesn't think are important. But I do think it's interesting that the first thing he does is give the address.
Yeah, absolutely. And, jumping to the end, the hang up, if he does hang up at the end, I don't think of that as anything except the reason you call 911 is not to be able to talk to a therapist, right? You call to ping someone so they can send help. And 911 calls are typically traced, right? They know how to call you back. I think they can locate you even if you don't say where you are. It may take longer, but it's like you've done your part. You're not trying to sit there and talk to someone about what you see. He thinks that his wife is about to die and he is in shock, trying to be there with her. And so the fact that if he hangs up, I don't necessarily think indicates anything because he's lodged the call, he's said what happened, and he has given the address, and that's kind of all you need in a 911 call.
Plus, and I don't want to be too tough on this woman because she's doing, the Lord's work, answering 911 calls, but she's really annoying. Like if I had just called about my wife falling down the stairs and I think she's about to die and I want help and she's asking me how many stairs she fell down, it's like, why are you asking me that? I don't know. What difference does it make? She's laying at the bottom of the stairs and she's bleeding. I need help, So I don't know. To me, and once again, I think it's dangerous to judge these calls because I think Michael Peterson is a very sophisticated person, and I have no doubt that he could fake his way through this. But there's nothing in this call that's obvious to me. Everything Peterson says is helpful. This is another thing, right? So people who analyze these calls, and I keep going back to the Ramsey call just because it's such a famous 911 call, and everybody who's listening to this has probably heard it. And one of the criticisms of that call is that Patsy Ramsey is incredibly unhelpful, that she just doesn't give them any information in the call that they might need. And that's led a lot of people to think, well, that means she's guilty, right? Like she never uses her daughter's name, and it's just a lot of things, right? But in this call, the very first thing he says is the address. He then tells the 911 operator exactly what the problem is. His wife has had an accident. She has fallen down the stairs. So that's the nature of the accident. He mentions that she's still breathing. Some people think that's weird, but I think the point he's making is,
get here fast.
If you guys hurry, you can save her. Exactly. I'm not calling you to report a dead body. I'm calling to report somebody who is hanging between life and death.
And if you have two options of sending, two addresses that you're competing for an ambulance, send it here because she could still live.
Right. He I don't know. I mean, I think, and I said at the beginning of this that we were going to talk about, was it a good idea or a bad idea for Rudolph to play this at the very beginning and the very end of his case? Does it accrue to Michael's benefit, or does it make him look like a murderer? And to me, listening to this, I can see why Rudolph played it, because I think it sounds like, whether it is or not, it sounds like a husband who has found his wife after having an accident is doing everything he can to make sure that medical personnel arrive as quickly as possible, prepared to do something to save her.
And let's talk about one other tactical reason to play this. I agree with you that I don't think anything in this call immediately sets off alarm bells in my mind that he's faking it. Another tactical reason to play it is there's a lot of emotion in this call, right? Whether it's fake or not, there's a lot of emotion. And you are going to elicit real emotions from people close to the case. That's your client, Michael Peterson, his children who are sitting behind him, and even Kathleen's daughter who has moved over to the prosecution side, right? Because it's very emotional. This is the moment in which their mother, his wife, is found at the bottom of the stairs and ultimately dies. And so the jury sees the reaction from his client. And it's hard to make your client cry, but if you can do it, it usually helps you out, right? Because it's probably real emotion.
Yeah. And there's a second call. We're not going to play it. It's very short. It's similar. Peterson sort of asking, where's help? I called for help. Why isn't it here? He points out in the second call that his wife's no longer breathing. I actually don't think Kathleen was probably breathing at the beginning either. I think he was wrong about that. I think the evidence backs that up. Some people think that the fact she wasn't breathing and he said she was breathing may indicate, once again, that he murdered her.
I think it's hard to tell when you walk onto a shocking scene like that, and if there's a flutter of, wind coming through or something, and it makes it look like you're breathing, you're going to say someone's breathing.
And nobody who's ever found a loved one in a state like this wants to believe they are dead. They want to believe they're alive. We're going to talk about Elizabeth Ratliff's death, and Michael Peterson was actually in not a very different position, but he was in a position where his friend and Elizabeth Ratliff's babysitter had found her there dead at the bottom of the stairs. And when Michael got there, she was saying she's still alive, she's still warm. And Michael had to say to her, no, sweetheart, she's not alive, she's dead. And it's sort of a similar thing where, you find somebody in that state, it's such a shocking thing. You want to believe they're still alive. You want to believe you can do something to help them. So I don't know. I understand why people take it that way. And maybe it is an example of Michael Peterson trying to cover things up. But I think the psychology of 911 tapes is a rough place to start your, either way, guilty or innocent. I think it's not actually, it's interesting. It's interesting to listen to. It's fun to analyze, but I don't know how useful it actually is.
And, let me hop back real quick to that timeline. Let's say that Michael Peterson wanted to murder Kathleen. This is a really, really close timeline in which to do it, because Todd leaves close to 11 or 10:30, let's say, p.m. And I guess the plan was for him to come back and probably to bring friends. If he left with a friend, maybe to come back with friends. And so he probably was going to come home that night. And I don't know about you, but I certainly don't want to expose my children to some grisly murder. If that was my plan, I would try to plan it probably somewhere else, or not where my kids walk into it and be scarred for life. That's just talking as a parent. I wouldn't put a bunch of stock into it, but that's a really tight timeline. And you can tell by the fact that the paramedics arrive basically simultaneously with Todd and his friends.
And let me just also say, and I'll just go ahead and put my cards on the table when it comes to this. Whether we'll talk about our theories and whether we think Michael Peterson killed Kathleen or not, there is no way, in my view, that he planned on killing Kathleen Peterson that night. This is not, it might have been premeditated in that he made a split-second decision. He was going to kill his wife, and that is premeditated murder. All it takes is right before you do it, you decide, I'm going to kill this person. But sort of the sense in which people normally think about it, like planning the murder, choosing the date, and then committing it, that didn't happen. To the extent the prosecution was trying to push this story of they needed money and he planned this murder, and, he planned to kill her just like he killed Elizabeth Ratliff, pushing her down the stairs or using the stairs or whatever. That didn't happen. I mean, if you look at the timeline, what Alice just said, everything about it, this was not that kind of premeditated murder. If it was a murder, it was a murder that happened in a split second where he either decided, I'm going to kill this person, or it was more of a sort of like rage, manslaughter, that kind of thing. There's no way this was premeditated.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. It's too messy for it to be well premeditated.
And that's that's the problem, and we keep coming back to this. The prosecution, and I get that they won, but the prosecution's theory in this case is so all over the place, right? And I'll save this discussion about Elizabeth Ratliff in a minute when we're going to talk about this and whether that should have been admissible. But the idea that he killed Elizabeth Ratliff using the stairs in some way, and so he decided to do the same thing with Kathleen, it just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if you actually do think this is like a long planned out thing, and he decided, well, I killed one person on the staircase, I'm going to kill another person on the staircase.
The serial killer, the serial staircase killer that strikes once every 17 years.
Right, exactly. It only makes sense if that's what you think happened. If it is just a spur of the moment thing, then the staircase seems to be random. It seems to be that's just how it kind of worked out. And that ties into the Ratliff stuff, and we'll talk about that in a second. Before we get to that, though, we're talking about this issue of whether or not Kathleen was still breathing. Michael says she was on the 911 call. Now, there's a problem with that. And this is something they don't talk about in the documentary, but when the autopsy was performed, we talked about acute ischemic neuronal necrosis.
That was really good. I wasn't even trying
There's something
to help
called
you. Did you like that?
Yeah. There's something called red neurons, which is essentially what that is, right? But that's a much easier way to think of it. And they're very rare, but they were found in Kathleen Peterson's brain. What they are typically caused by is a slow death that is the result of blood loss and accompanying oxygen depreciation to the brain. So it's where you can imagine this, right? You're dying, you're bleeding out, your brain is getting less and less blood, it's taking you a while to die. That's what happens is you get these red neurons. Now, the problem is, to the extent we understand the way red neurons work, and you can imagine there hasn't been maybe as much study in this as you would like to think there would be, just because imagine how difficult it would be to study this. Rule of thumb is it takes about 2 hours for these to develop, maybe more. Now, there are things that can affect that, but say it did take 2 hours. If it took 2 hours, that does not line up with Michael Peterson's timeline. What that lines up with is Michael Peterson kills her much earlier in the night, maybe around midnight. And then he's basically trying to figure out, what am I going to do? How am I going to deal with this? Which, once again, strike against long-planned murder. And at some point, he comes to the conclusion, maybe thinking back to Elizabeth Ratliff, I'll make it look like she fell down the stairs. And that's what he does. But because it takes him so long, these red neurons develop. A lot of people put a lot of stock in this. There are reasons to. That's a good piece of evidence. It's a good piece of forensic evidence that you can use in a trial to show that the story the defense is telling you is unlikely or even impossible. The problem with that is you do have Henry Lee, who testified that you can have these neurons develop in as little as 30 minutes, and that there are various factors, including trauma, which you obviously have here, that can influence their development. Another thing, I read some papers on this, another thing that can affect their development is if you have a loss of oxygen and then all of a sudden you start breathing again, right? Like, so you have like depressed oxygen and then maybe, CPR, or just for whatever reason, you recover a little bit and you're breathing more than you were before. Apparently that can cause these red neurons to develop fairly quickly. So it's not as cut and dry as some people want you to think. I do think ordinarily it is the case that it takes about 2 hours for these to develop. So that is a point in the prosecution's column, but it's not a slam dunk. It doesn't mean it's impossible for what Michael Peterson said happened to have happened. If Henry Lee is right, then it fits perfectly with Michael Peterson's timeline.
Brett, that was fascinating. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, you reminded me after a very long, hard day, why I really do love being an attorney. We get to kind of learn other trades and become the expert when our case requires it, right? Like one day I get to become a doctor, another day I get to become a pharmacist or a banker. And what you just did, by the way, for everybody, is exactly what we do when we cross an expert. An expert says one thing, and you have to research everything within that field to know how to counter it if there is something to counter. And what we have found is that even though science is supposed to be science in that everyone says, oh, it's an exact science, there's always question about it in our cases. And I'm not a scientist by trade, but what Brett brings up, I think, pokes a really big hole in what the prosecution is saying, even if typically what they say could happen. There is another side of the story.
The best thing is when you can find the expert saying the exact opposite thing of what they're saying in the trial. And you'd be surprised at how often that happens.
Happens
you can
all
cite
the
it back to
time.
them.
and they, yeah, they really do. So if you're an expert, we call them experts, be careful because your transcripts are probably public, and you can bet your attorneys on the other side are reading those transcripts to try to trip you up if you say something that contradicts yourself later on.
And one other thing about this, and it's something that is unsettling and it's dissatisfying, and if you think too much about it, it can really bother you about our system. So, we have criminal justice, it's very important, and we have beyond a reasonable doubt, and we want to make sure that we're putting the right people in jail. But we also want to make sure that murderers are off the street, and there's sort of this balance. And you see a lot of that in forensics, because the fact of the matter is every person is different. And we can have these sort of guidelines and rules of thumb about the way the body works and about what will happen in this circumstance and what this means and what that means. But different people are different. And to a certain extent, there is a real weakness in forensic science when it comes to things like rigor mortis. I mean, we see that more and more about when does rigor mortis set and when does it release, and how much can you really know about when someone was killed based on stomach contents and digestive system. I mean, there are so many of these issues, and a lot of you guys are well versed in this because you know about wrongful convictions and you've seen how this evidence can go the wrong way. And I would just caution you to think about that and think about those things in these cases that are controversial, because I think there's a real confirmation bias problem where you see a case like Michael Peterson, and Michael Peterson is not sympathetic. Like, I don't find Michael Peterson to be particularly sympathetic. He's not sympathetic in the way a lot of people are who are involved in these Innocence Project style cases. And I think that makes people want to believe that Michael Peterson is guilty. And so a lot of the holes that people would poke in other convictions, they don't normally want to do that with Michael Peterson. So they do things like they look at the red neurons and it's like, slam dunk, 2 hours, he did it. And I don't think you can do that.
And let's talk about another unusual aspect. The blowpoke. It was absolutely missing. It was missing. And the prosecution waved their similar blowpoke around saying the blowpoke is probably the murder weapon and it's missing. And then wham! They find it. The defense finds it. I do not understand how in the world they didn't, the defense or someone didn't find this blowpoke for the trial. I know that the investigators actually did find it at the very beginning, but how did it sit in the garage unnoticed when this is what the prosecution puts their stock in? So I don't understand how you don't find the blowpoke, and it is kind of sitting, it's not like it's hidden away. It's just leaning against a wall in a corner of the garage, and the garage is kind of like, it seems like a basement. It's like a dugout. So it's dark there, but it's not hidden under, say, a pile of sticks or anything.
And they even talk about how much they looked. They looked all over that house a dozen times.
They scoured the house. And, the daughter, one of the daughters is watching hours and hours of home videos to try and see what year she finds the blowpoke missing in the home videos. And somehow they're all living in this house because Michael Peterson is not in jail during trial. He is at home with his his family and his brothers and attorneys. They're like using his house as the war room for trial prep, and no one finds this. And then here's even more mind-boggling than people not finding the blowpoke in time for the start of the trial. How in the world, once the defense finds the blowpoke, does the government still win their case? That I don't get at all.
Yeah, I don't either. And I know we talked about Dwayne Deaver and how convincing he was, and I know he was convincing, but man, you say
I would
this
consider
is the murder
dismissing
weapon?
my case if that happened,
Oh,
like in the middle of trial.
yeah.
I'd be like, crud.
It's like that My Cousin Vinny moment, where they realize that the differential on the cars is different, and so it couldn't have been their car, whatever. It's a similar type of thing. And look, it's important, right? It's not just, well, they had a theory, it was the blowpoke, and it wasn't the blowpoke. There's a reason they picked the blowpoke, because this is a weird death.
They needed a really specific
Exactly.
murder weapon.
Exactly. All the things, like, look, what's the most likely thing that happens here? You get in a fight and you're going to murder your wife and you're at the bottom of the stairs and you're on top of her. You just slam her head into the steps, right? I mean, that would be the thing you would do if you're thinking about this. Like, how did she get that damage? He's murdering her or whatever. But the problem is there are no fractures and there's no brain damage and there's no swelling and there's no hemorrhaging. There's none of the things that you would expect.
There's no indication, honestly, she was beat in the head. It's like someone just sliced her head, which is really bizarre.
Exactly. That's what it's like. It's the weirdest thing. And Rudolph does a really good job at the trial of pointing this out. Like, he gets every single death by beating in the last, 20 years or whatever, and every single one of them involves a skull fracture. So you have to have a weapon like this. It couldn't have been that Michael Peterson, he's coming up from the pool and he grabs a piece of firewood and beats her with it. It can't be that, because that would have caused... And once again, you're trying to kill someone. You're trying to murder your wife. This is not an accident. You're not going to lightly tap her on the head. You're going to beat her as hard as you can. And Michael Peterson, you can see in the documentary, this is a buff guy. I mean, this is a guy who works out all the time, probably to pick up dudes at the gym, but still, he's working out all the time, right? Like, he could do some damage. And so you need that kind of weapon, hollow, able to inflict those wounds, but not do more damage. And yet, the one thing they picked, and the only thing they could figure out, the only thing that fit that bill that was missing, it's not it. And that's why, if you watch the documentary, Rudolph says, like, it's going to be all about the blowpoke. That's what he focused on. And how that's not reasonable doubt, I don't know.
I thought for sure when they pulled out that blowpoke that it was over. That he was.
I thought it was over too.
He was going to for sure be acquitted, or the defense would. Or the prosecution would just say, "Never mind."
Like, oops.
Never mind. Got the wrong person. So sorry about that.
And the craziest. This case is so crazy. The craziest thing about the blowpoke, in my view, is. And you don't know this just watching the documentary, but the situation in which it's introduced. So they find that blowpoke at the house, and they call Judge Hudson. So Orlando Hudson comes out to the house. They have an ex parte meeting. And ex parte means it's one party and the judge. It's very rare. It's only in certain circumstances. Usually you can't do that. Usually you need both parties there. But in certain circumstances, you can. So they found this piece of evidence, and essentially they want the judge... Honestly, I think this is weird. They want the judge to be there to witness it where it was found. Why? I mean, is the judge now a witness or something? I'm not even sure why this went the way it did.
That is a really bizarre thing. I wouldn't come out if I were the judge.
Yeah, I'd be like, no, you take a picture, whatever, right? Introduce it later. Like, I'm not going to come out there. I'm not going to make myself a witness, right? Because the question of whether or not that blowpoke was there and had been there is a material question, right? And now you've got the judge out there so he can testify to the fact it's there. But in any event, he comes out, he sees it, and he tells the defense, okay, collect this, and if you guys want to introduce it into evidence, make a motion, right? So that day, Rudolph, he's still not exactly sure, or this is the story he tells. He's still not exactly sure if he's going to use it or if he's not going to use it. And it's almost that moment in the O.J. Simpson case where Christopher Darden decides to make O.J. put the glove on. And that was something they weren't going to do. And he just made a split-second decision. He was going to make him try on the glove. And it blew up in his face. Well, this is kind of the opposite. He apparently makes a split-second decision. When he calls the police officer to the stand, he doesn't know why he's being called. The prosecution does not know that he has found this blowpoke. This is completely improper. You're never supposed to do that. Not the defense, not the prosecution. This is not Perry Mason. It's not Matlock. If you have evidence, the defense has a discovery obligation with the prosecution. You know, we talked about the prosecution's obligation. The defense has one too. It also is supposed to share evidence.
Here's the reason, guys. Because trial is not supposed to have Perry Mason moments. You're not supposed to shock people at trial because the whole system is trying to avoid trial. So that's why you don't have these surprises. You're not trying to have an unfair fight on either side.
Right. You want to know what actually happened, right? Like, this is actually supposed to be about finding truth. So not about a show or a circus. But they don't tell him. And when he pulls that blowpoke out, apparently the prosecution was so shocked, and you can see this in the documentary, they were so shocked they didn't even think to object. So they could have objected and been like, can we have a sidebar or something to talk about this? But they don't even.
I would have blown up. And I mean, we would have had a long sidebar. There would have been argument and probably briefing about it.
And maybe it works to the prosecution's advantage, because then later on they're like, no big deal. But it was, we didn't say it was the blowpoke. We said it could be the blowpoke, right? So if they'd have blown up about it, maybe that would have, made the jury think it was a bigger deal than it was. But it wasn't a strategic decision they made not to do that. It was just such a shocking courtroom moment that you never see. You never see anything like that. So really crazy stuff with the blowpoke.
Yeah, no, the proper thing probably would have been for the judge to say, well, make sure you turn it over, and I believe we're probably going to have some sort of motion in limine about this.
Yeah, exactly.
And a motion in limine is just to deal with argument outside of the jury. So typically it comes before a trial. You file a motion in limine if you know you're going to anticipate an argument. So you brief it ahead of time, and sometimes you get the judge to rule ahead of time so you don't have the jury having to get up and step out every time you guys want to have some sort of fight.
Yeah, and motion in limine is one of those like fancy Latin terms that lawyers like to throw around so that regular people feel like they don't know what's going on. But basically, and Alice is not doing that. That's what it's called. It's a motion in limine.
That was like, wow, that was so directed, Brett. It's because I don't know what it's called, not in Latin.
Well, it's in limine, like the liminal. It's at the limit, basically, or like at the threshold, right? In the beginning. So it's a motion that's supposed to happen before the trial starts, essentially to decide what evidence is coming in, what's not coming in. In this circumstance, with late discovered evidence, you would also file a motion in limine and basically say, look, there is no way this should come in. Now, I think it would have come in no matter what. There at least should have been some discussion and some preparation. And that officer who got called up to the stand...
There definitely should not have been surprised.
should have known what he was testifying about. Yeah, the whole thing is crazy.
So, quick question, Brett. Let's start with the first one. If you are a detective and you show up at the scene that night and you relay this to a prosecutor, you as a prosecutor, do you bring this as a murder charge? Do you even prosecute this? So we're not talking about all the discovery. You haven't done all of this discovery yet.
So you're saying
you have limited discovery, right? It's the first few days. That's when a lot of pressure, especially on local DAs, is to bring a charge, right? They typically don't want you to wait a very long time for something this gruesome, this public. Even though we typically like to investigate our cases so that we're ready to go to trial, but we know that local DAs often are given a lot of pressure when there has been something high profile like this. So let's say you have some discovery, right? You understand the story, you know what the scene looks like, you have some potential motives, whatever.
I think I would certainly begin.
I would too, Brett. I really would.
The prosecution, because you have a situation where the wife's dead, The husband's the one who found her. Husbands are always going to be your chief suspect. There's a ton of blood. The scene is messy. And then sort of the more you learn, there's plenty there to bring the prosecution. You find out he's having an affair. You do the autopsy and you see the unusual wounds. Now, I guess the tougher question for me is when
you go to trial.
When you get the autopsy back, you don't have a murder weapon, right? And you can find no proof that a murder weapon was disposed of. You get the autopsy back, and even though you want this to be blunt force trauma, it's not. This woman essentially bled to death. Then, I think you start wondering whether or not the problem I have with this case, particularly with Dwayne Deaver screwing things up as badly he did. And let's just talk about that for a second. We talked about this some last time about Dwayne Deaver, but one point we didn't make that I think is worth making. It's easy to think that Michael Peterson got off on a technicality because that's sort of what we're taught to believe about the justice system when something like this happens. But in reality, getting a conviction overturned is so difficult. Once you're convicted of something, you may have hope that your appeal is going to be successful. 99 times out of 100, it's not, right? Some of you guys follow the Adnan Syed case, and some of y'all think he's innocent, and you see just how difficult it's been for him to get a new trial. He had one, and then it got reversed, right? And so he's not going to have one. It is really hard, and it is a testament to just how bad and just how prejudicial that evidence was that conviction was overturned. Because normally, no matter what errors you make, the conviction is going to stand because of all the other evidence, right? We call it harmless error. So even if you have an error, if it's harmless because of the weight of the evidence, it's not overturned. And if you look at the appellate decisions in this case, you had basically three things that came up. The search warrant was invalid, and so a lot of the stuff that was recovered from the search shouldn't have been. The Elizabeth Ratliff stuff, and the completely improper closing argument by the prosecution. And the appellate court found the closing argument and the search warrants to be error. Those things shouldn't have happened. They actually did not find error in the Ratliff thing, which surprises me, but we'll talk about that. But even though they found error in those two major things, they essentially said, with all the blood evidence and everything else, there's enough evidence to sustain the conviction, so we're not going to overturn it on that basis. So that should just give you an idea of how critical this blood evidence was and what a huge deal it was that Deaver had lied and withheld evidence and manufactured evidence.
So in Aphrodite Jones's book, A Perfect Husband, it's reported that the police were actually able to determine what Peterson had deleted from his computer. Remember, we said the day before Kathleen's death, a bunch of files were deleted. So they discovered that 216 files from his computer were deleted the day before Kathleen died. And he also deleted 352 files 2 days following her death. The emails reportedly in part detailed Michael's financial struggles, which might suggest some sort of motive if he did in fact kill his wife. Okay, I have a couple issues with this though. If he's going to go delete almost 600 files, why not go ahead and delete all the gay porn and the affairs and the emails? That's what you should be deleting, not the financial woes, because the financial woes doesn't make sense. You just got a huge advance on your book, and Kathleen isn't, based on this advance, her salary is such a small part of it. And I mean, was there life insurance money to be collected here?
There was. So on the advance, he hadn't actually gotten an advance. He had sold the rights to a movie, right? Or he was under an agreement to sell the rights to the movement. It could have been a lot of money, but it wasn't like, a check for $1 million was going to show up next week. But I think you're right, because the financial troubles are something you're not going to be able to cover up by deleting a few emails from your computer, right? Anybody who looks at your finances is going to see that. But what you could cover up by deleting files from your computer is the gay stuff right? The affairs,
Right.
the gay porn. And number one, I don't know what difference it makes that he deleted some files before Kathleen's death. I think the files he deleted afterward, maybe those are more probative because you can say, see, he's trying to cover something up. I don't know. I don't know about this. It doesn't, some people point to this. Like I said, I read this book, A Perfect Husband by Aphrodite Jones, and she certainly thought it was significant. It's certainly something I think you use if you're the prosecution. You point to it. You say, look, what's he trying to hide 2 days after his wife's dead? And he's deleting emails. Like, what's he thinking, right? Like, why is he doing that? So I'm not going to say it's not suspicious, but for the exact reason you said, I just don't know that it's actually as interesting as people make it.
It just doesn't seem complete. If you're going to delete, go delete be a lot more kind of damning evidence about your character, right? About problems within the marriage. This is how it's going to be read if you're messaging other people for companionship.
Yeah, if you thought about, because you have to assume he thought, I need to delete files from my computer because eventually they're going to come for it, right? You have to assume that's what he's thinking. He is trying to cover this up. How would you not think to delete those files? Particularly if the reason this happened was because Kathleen discovered those files on your computer. If you knew that because you were the one who killed her and you killed her over that, wouldn't that be the first thing you delete? The thing that led to the murder? Why wouldn't you get rid of that? And yet it's all there. It's all still there on his computer for the police to find.
Yeah, and I mean, let's talk about their money problems a little bit.
Sure.
Because the investigators did discover that there was evidence of financial woes in the family despite them kind of living this lavish lifestyle, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And everybody had problems, right? So, they got 3 daughters in college. One of them's going to an Ivy League school. They have credit card debt of $142,000, which, I mean, can you even imagine having that much credit card debt? That's
a lot of.
That's like
I don't know.
That makes
pizzas?
me anxious just thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I know. Look, we say that. I'm sure there's a lot of folks out there who have a lot of credit card debt because that's the way a lot of people get by. But usually, it's not when you're living in a mansion. If you're living in a mansion, maybe you should have a little bit more responsibility with how you spend your money. But whatever. So Kathleen, we talked about this before. She had $2 million worth of stock that was now worth $50,000. Another just, huge blow. But
So let's talk about her life insurance, though.
Kathleen did have a life insurance policy. It's unclear exactly how much it was worth. It's a funny thing about life insurance policies. I feel like you can never nail it down. But it was worth between $1.2 and $1.8 million. And Michael was the beneficiary. And look, Michael knew they were having trouble. I mean, a few days before his wife died, he had actually emailed his first wife in Germany to talk to her about how their sons, Clayton and Todd, were also carrying these huge credit card debts and having to make these huge monthly interest payments, and had actually asked Patricia Peterson, that was Michael's first wife, to consider taking out a home equity loan to help pay their son's debts off. And he said in that email, quote, "I'm worried sick about them. It is simply not possible for me to discuss this with Kathleen." And you can imagine why. Number one, because it's his son's from previous marriage. And number two, because they didn't have any money themselves. So it's not like they could be worried too much about what's going on in Clayton and Todd's life. But, and here's the problem, and Alice pointed this out, it seems like Michael was right there. He was right on the verge of solving some of these problems. If that movie gets made, everything goes away, right? They make that movie, he's going to be, number one, he's going to make money off that. He's going to make a bunch of money off that movie, whether it's successful or not. But if it's successful, he's going to make money off that movie. He's going to sell 1,000 copies of his book that's going to have the poster from that movie with Ben Affleck or whoever on the cover. He's got these other books that he wrote that he's going to be able to sell. He's going to be able to get a huge advance from some New York publisher to write another book, the sequel to the book that got made into a movie. It's all right there for him. It's right there. And you can't think given that things were so dire that he had to kill Kathleen right now. And there's no evidence that he didn't love Kathleen. There's no evidence that they didn't have a good marriage. And even if Michael was willing, imagine that Michael is a psychopath. And I think you basically have to believe he's a psychopath to believe he did some of these things. Even if he's a psychopath who's pretty happy with Kathleen, right? I mean, he's been with her for a while and he has no reason to kill her. He likes his life. He lives in a mansion. He's about to be a big shot movie writer or whatever. He's got to know if Kathleen ends up dead, that's going to be a problem for him. And it's certainly going to be a problem for his movie. So once again, I go back to this. I do not believe that money was the reason for this. I do not believe this was a long planned murder to get an insurance policy. If Michael Peterson killed Kathleen Peterson, it was because she found out that he was having an affair with, other men, or having affairs with other men. She confronted him about it. She said she was going to divorce him. He snapped and he murdered her. That's the only way this murder went down.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And here's what Michael says in response to the messaging of other men and meeting up for sex. He says, no, Kathleen knew I was bisexual and she was okay. She was fine with it. And she also knew that I was seeking sexual companionship with men outside of our marriage. That piece, I don't believe. Now, we've talked about before how people lie for reasons other than covering up a crime, right? They do it because they want to preserve their pride, sense of self, whatever. The way he answers that question of whether Kathleen knew he was bisexual and whether she knew that he was seeking, sex outside of the marriage, I did not believe his answer. And here's why. He says, no, we never discussed it explicitly, but she knew. So what I think probably is the case is that she probably did know that he had bisexual tendencies, but it was kind of one of those things like, let's not open Pandora's box because I'm happily married to you and I don't really want to ask that direct question. And she probably would not have been surprised should she have found out that he was bisexual, but I don't think that they sat down and had conversations about this. Like, what's on the calendar, honey? Well, next Tuesday I'm meeting up with Brad, so we're not going to be able to have dinner with the Smiths. I don't think that happened. But I also don't think if he lied about that, it necessarily means that he killed Kathleen.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do not think she knew, at least in any explicit way. I think Michael Peterson wants to believe that she knew and that she was fine with it and she understood what he was doing. That is such a typical rationalization that people have for so many different things, right? Where you just want to tell yourself, oh, the other person, they would understand. They would understand if I did this, or whatever. I don't think she knew. I think it's possible she knew that he was bisexual. His brother knew, and it's like he had, if you watch the documentary, I can't remember if it's in the documentary or in the book, actually. I think it might be in the book. Caitlin Atwater talks about how that Michael had all these books in his office about, being gay, essentially. He had books about homosexuality. He had some other books that were like, like comedies or sort of gay fiction. I mean, he had a lot of stuff that, I guess he could have just been an enlightened person, but usually you wouldn't expect to find in sort of maybe the average straight man's man cave, right? And they would take the book or the various books and they would like hide them in each other's rooms and then be like, haha, you're gay, right? Because that's the kind of thing kids do. But stuff like that, they didn't see the significance of those books until all this came out and they actually talk about it. They're like, oh, huh, well, that makes sense then, right? But you got to think Kathleen did. I mean, Kathleen knew this. Now, did she know he was having an affair? Did she know he was meeting up with escorts? I can't imagine that she knew that. I don't know. It's a mystery. It is a mystery. And I don't think there's an answer to it. And I don't think there's any way to know. I think what Candace Zapparini and we'll talk about and next time, actually, sort of the appropriateness of some of the stuff the prosecution did with this. But I think the things that they said about how she never would have accepted this and she never would have been fine with this is way over the line and not accurate. I think it's impossible for anyone, even someone's sister, to know what another person is willing to accept from someone that they love. And you see that all the time, from things like this to substance abuse to someone being abusive, physically abusive. You just see it all the time. And so I don't think it's one of those things where you can definitively say that if Kathleen knew this, it would be the end of their marriage.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's very hard to say how she would have reacted.
And one thing people say, and one thing they say in the documentary is, or maybe it's in the book, I get confused, but was she left her one husband, her first husband, because he cheated on her. So why wouldn't she leave Michael? Because it's even worse if he cheated on her with her man. Well, maybe it is. I don't know. Is it?
But you're in a different stage of life, right? She's later in her life. And I mean, it's honest. A lot of people don't want to be alone as they get older. And she's seemingly very happy with Michael, and she doesn't want to rock the boat. This happens all the time. People suspect that their spouse is having an affair, and they kind of don't want to know because they're so happy with their life, and they know if they look behind the veil, it could all come crumbling down.
And even Brad, when he testifies, he says that most of the men he sees are in exactly that situation, happily married, mostly heterosexual, who are just doing this thing. And you could see Kathleen thinking, actually, I would rather, there's an excuse for you to do that, right? Like, that's something that I can't provide you, and if that's an itch you need to scratch, so be it. But you cheat on me with another woman, I'm going to have a problem, right? Like, I could totally see that.
Right.
And we just don't know. So the last thing we want to talk about very quickly, because we've been going for a while.
The documentary. Let's talk about the documentary, because I think we have to give this caveat. We've referenced a lot the Netflix series called The Staircase, and it is great. You should go read it. You should go watch it. But you should also know that this documentary crew had all access. It's kind of incredible how much access they had to this investigation. But I think at first the prosecution and the defense had all signed up to do this documentary, but at some point the prosecution decides to pull out of their involvement in the Staircase documentary, and then they turn around and they try to demand the footage that the documentary has shot so that they can turn it over as evidence to be used in the trial. And the only way the documentary crew can keep this from happening is that they decide to join the defense team as David Rudolph's employees. And then, in order to protect the footage, they send all of the footage back to France. We say that because you should keep that in mind, that they definitely are Team Michael, and they're shooting from that perspective. That's where they get all the access. And there's one more thing you should keep in mind about potential bias, is that Michael Peterson and a Staircase editor, Sophie Brunette, had a relationship that lasted almost a decade.
Yeah, so
that could certainly shade. Yeah.
When you're thinking about those shots of the prosecution that makes them look not all that good, that might be the reason. I'm surprised after all this happened that Orlando Hudson, the judge in this case, continued to allow them to have so much access. You'd think at some point he would be like, you know what, this has become problematic, but he does not.
I mean, they have so much. They have so much access that they're like going back to the Staircase where you only bring cuffed inmates.
Yeah.
That I've never been back there.
Yeah, they're going when he's arrested. They're walking with him back there to the. It's crazy. It's like they were basically told, you can do anything. You can go anywhere you want, do anything you want, and everybody knew that. All the police knew that. Court security, just everybody knew. Like, don't mess with the Staircase guys.
And just to put this in perspective, there is this long, very heated debate about whether cameras are allowed at the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court. And cameras are not allowed. That's why you see all those kind of cartoon drawings of people arguing at the Supreme Court. And so for this court to have so much access, I've actually never seen it before in a courtroom.
Yeah, it's wild. It's completely wild. And there's a lot of criticism of the documentary. We've relied on it a lot, but yeah, you definitely should remember that this is not an unbiased view. It's a good documentary. It's a great thing. It's a great watch. Very well done, but not unbiased.
I can't believe how many people they got to talk. I can't believe they got the judge to admit that he made wrong rulings at the end of the documentary. I was like, what? I rewinded it to listen to it. I was like, did he just say that he was wrong in letting in the Ratliff information and also the gay porn information.
I mean, he basically said that he would find him not guilty if he were a juror.
He did. He said there was reasonable doubt. He absolutely said that. I was like, what?
It's a remarkable thing. No, this whole case is remarkable, and there's so many things about it that are remarkable, and that's why we spent so much time on this case. And I hope you guys aren't bored to death with us as we go through all this. But there's just so much stuff to talk about, and so many fascinating angles to cover. We've been with you for a while today. We know you guys. You got to get to work and stuff. You can't just sit in your car and listen to us all day. Unfortunately, I wish you could. We talked a lot. We've talked about a lot of stuff. We've said some stuff that is controversial. We said some stuff. We probably made some mistakes, or we've left out some stuff that you're going to think is important. As always, we want to hear from you. We pride ourselves on responding to you guys as much as possible on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. You can hit us up at prosecutorspod. We have a website, prosecutorspodcast.com. You can email us, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. And let us know what you think. Send us your thoughts. Send us any evidence we've missed. And, get ready for tomorrow because we got more. We got a whole another show. I think tomorrow we'll wrap it up. And maybe, who knows? We may figure out who did this before the day is finished. But until then...
It never gets not funny. Sorry.
I know. It doesn't.
I'm sorry. Please
Some of you are like,
out.
what in the world are y'all talking about? But you'll know.
Who can
You'll
say?
Know yes, who can say? Who can say? In any event, we will see you guys tomorrow. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. And welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I am your host, Breast.
Okay, I just broke the microphone. I was like, before you walk on stage in theater, you like pull it together. I had it pulled together and then I exploded onto my mic laughing. Should we just call it quits for today now? Oh my god.
Just release that.
You need to be... You're demoted. You don't get to say your name anymore. I get to say your name now. Did you say that just because you wanted to introduce yourself as America's sweetheart? Alright, this is good. We have 5 minutes of laugh track and no content for our podcast. This is a good day of shooting. Okay, this is a great day. You're still laughing? How many times do you think you've said your name in your life? Oh my gosh! Are you hyperventilating?
I don't know if this actually that funny.
It was very funny. Oh gosh, let me wipe my tears away. Oh gosh. Oh gosh. Whew.
I don't know if I can do this tonight.
You're gonna have to extend our outro song.
That was the funniest thing that's happened on the podcast so far. Because I was trying to think of what I was going to call you today. So I wasn't focused on my name. Maybe you should do the introduction today.